second installment of this brand new podcast series, eLearning Africa, in conversation with. I'm Rob Vember and look forward to bringing you insights, advice, and new solutions from digital learning and ICT experts and leading practitioners on the challenges faced by African education and training professionals. This podcast is brought to you by eLearning Africa, the Pan-African Network for ICT for Education, Training and Skills Development, Africa's home for ideas, innovation and sustainable solutions for education, training and skills development since 2005. In this episode of the podcast, I'm in conversation with Aida, Opoku-Mensah.
The ship has just left. I was frantically trying to get them to finish off.
Was it a literal ship?
It should have been one.
I caught up with Aida in the midst of packing up 20 years of her life as she retires from the UN Economic Commission for Africa and prepares to make the move from its Addis Ababa headquarters back to her native Ghana. In our conversation, Aida shared her views on the evolution of ICT in Africa over the last 20 years and shares her thoughts on what's to come. She explains why we're going to miss the 2030 SDGs deadline and how COVID has exacerbated our challenges in many of the focal areas. She talks through the factors necessary to successfully create an e-learning and online learning experience, and we talk about digital currencies for the continent, why Africa needs to be ready for crypto, and what's the first thing she checks when she wakes up in the morning. Aida leaves UNECA as its Chief of Staff to the Executive Secretary and Special Advisor on SDGs. Her 2 decades with the Commission centered around roles within the areas of ICT as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. In her capacity as Director of the ICT Science and Technology Division, she managed the work program of the division, harnessing information, science and technology for development, and built constituencies within Africa with academia, CSOs, private sector, governments, youth, women, media, MPs, and collaborated with partners to support programs. She's supported member states' national ICT for D policies and successfully managed the formulation of national ICT for development policies in over 30 countries. While Special Advisor on SDGs and the focal person for combating illicit financial flows, Aida coordinated and provided strategic advice on SDG activities within the Commission. She led and completed the development of the AU-UN framework on implementing Agenda 2063 and the SDGs, which was signed by the UN Secretary-General and the AU Chairperson in 2018. Aida holds a BA in Linguistics and Swahili from the University of Ghana, a Diploma in International Studies from the University of London, a Master of Arts in Communication Policy from the School of Social Sciences at City University London, and a PhD in Political Science and Communications from the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds. Aida has written extensively on Africa's development, especially in the area of ICTs, science and technology. She received the Geospatial World Leadership Award for making a difference in promoting geospatial technology in Africa in 2012, and the African Female Diplomat of the Year Award from Ben TV UK's 2012 Diplomatic Awards. The movies are all done, all out the way, the ship has sailed?
Yeah,
Good.
The ship is sailing, hopefully.
Were you doing all the packing yourself? Did you have a bit of help?
I had a bit of help. I did most of it myself because you see, you have to sort out things you need and things you don't need, and so things you want to give away. So you have to do it more or less yourself. But I did have help, and then the shippers came in and packed what I wanted them to pack.
Great. How many years were you packing up?
20.
Oh, man.
Yeah, that was painful.
I'm sure of it. So maybe as a starting point, you're retiring from this position. Are you retiring from work altogether? Have you decided that yet? You're taking a bit of a mental break. You're shaking your head. So no, you're retiring from your current position.
I'm retiring from my current position, but and yes, I will take a mental break. But before our meeting, I was in another meeting about with a former colleague about publishing a book. So immediately everything is kicking in, and let's do this and let's do that now that you have time. So I know that that's going to be my life going forward, but it's nice to be able to pick and choose what you want to do.
Yeah, and I don't know whether you're at liberty to say just yet, but the content of the book, is it a book about your experience, or is it more specific content?
There are two books. One, I'm going to be writing a book on the whole information society revolution in Africa, and the role that I played within the UN on that. So that's one book, which is kind of an autobiographical look at that. And then the second book is with a colleague that when I worked in the UN, I collaborated on writing several books on technology and ICTs. And this time we're looking at the virtual economy as a result of ICTs.
So we're definitely going to pick up on both of those. Let's start with let's start with the first book in scare quotes. Looking back at the IT revolution, looking back at the last 2 decades, how would you sum up the evolution and how the continent has transformed? And again, we use that word transform, however you see fit, or moved along the spectrum. How would you sum up the last 20 years in terms of progress?
It's been the whole evolution of ICTs in Africa has been in fits and starts. There were some countries on the continent or some leaders, I must say, who saw or who had that vision, who were visionary in what they recognized that ICTs could do for society, for economy. And so there's that group, and I must say it's a very small group of countries. And then there are others who were kind of giving platitudes, and we'll do this, we'll do that, but then didn't put enough investments into the deployment of ICTs and for it to fulfill its full promise. And I know this, and because we worked, me and my team at the UN Economic Commission for Africa, we worked on national ICT policies, and we knew the countries that had these policies and plans in place. But we also knew that beyond that, there wasn't much movement, because you need to move a policy from its philosophical and intentional purposes to reality, and that unfortunately did not happen in a number of countries, even though they wanted these policies, because once you put such a plan in place, you have to back it up with resources, and that didn't happen, with exception of a few countries like Rwanda, to some extent Ghana. So that is the summary. Now, if I was to fast forward it to now, having a continent that will focusing or supposed to be focusing on putting in place policies, e-policies and plans in order to launch ICTs in society and in the economy. Fast forward to 2020 and the pandemic, and then kind of hit every country in its face. And then suddenly ICTs became a very important vehicle. And so it will be interesting. It will be interesting to see those countries that that had policies. You will see, and certainly I kind of did a quick assessment of Rwanda, and they had a policy, and they had several policies. Their policies were within 5-year frames, and there were certain deliverables that they had to achieve. And all of that helped that kind of country to get back on its feet in a virtual world. Other countries that didn't really take the policy making aspects of ICT seriously, I think they struggled. They struggled because once you close down schools and the internet is not as pervasive in your society as it should be and it could be, then you're in trouble. Because schools you won't be able to move into a virtual classroom. Some were innovative, and Ghana, I must say, did that, where they then resorted to old traditional technology methods such as TV and radio. So this kind of, you had this process, and I must say, at the beginning when we started, it was difficult when you had African policymakers tell you this is a luxury. And I'm saying this to juxtaposition the current situation, where you had African policymakers tell you ICTs is a luxury we can't afford. We need water, we need roads, we need medicines. And I would love to go back to those policymakers and say, well, what say you now?
Was it a lack of foresight, a lack of vision, or was it simply by their account, a mathematical calculation that we just don't have the resources? But as you say, surely now looking back, going, well, ICT should have been embedded in all of those issues that you were having to start with, your water troubles and your medical issues and transportation thereof. So what was that main stumbling block? Just pure stubbornness?
I had always, based on my experience, and now that I don't work for the UN anymore, but one of the challenges that I found, or one of the realizations I came to, is that African policymakers were not sufficiently technologically savvy. It wasn't, and I don't know why, but with the exception of a few policymakers from a few countries in Africa, by and large, and if you remove the ICT ministers in some of these countries, by and large, African policymakers were not technologically savvy. And I'm not sure whether it was the orientation of their governments or not. But clearly, if you have a health minister tell you my priority is medicines and not technology, then there's something wrong. Or you have a minister, of education tell you that, oh, no, e-learning is too advanced for us, then there's something wrong. And I constantly kind of got that. And even where you kind of did a great deal of awareness and advocacy around these issues to them, their response was, yeah, we're getting it, or I'm getting it, but I don't quite know what to do. So I think it's a bit of the visionary aspect from the top, because I'll tell you, when ECA put in place a national ICT strategy for Rwanda, President Kagame had a retreat with his cabinet on the policy document to discuss the policy and how it impacted in all the line ministries that the cabinet members were holding. And then charged them to say, well, based on this national policy, each ministry should derive their own policy or their own strategy from this policy in which they will implement. And it takes that kind of visionary leadership to be able to get ministers to see that, oh my God, even if you are in that cabinet retreat and you don't even understand and you don't even believe, oh, well, what is it going to do for me? At least there's that pressure for you to find out what it can do for your ministry. In many other countries, it didn't quite go that way. It just was, well, there's the ICT policy, let's implement it, and that was it. Even though later versions of the policy, we did look at ICTs in education, ICTs in health, ICTs in security, and all of those things. But that kind of approach wasn't quite there, and I can assure you it's because this kind of directive did not come from the top.
Can you speak from your own personal experience how this became your niche, your area, and your body of work? And you can certainly push back as much as you feel you need to, but as a Black African woman as well, looking at the space and the continent that we both call home, you stand out. All that you have achieved and that you're able to retire from this particular position after so many years. What was it at what stage that made you realize this is a key part of our future that we should be pumping so much energy and resources into?
From my own personal experience, I'll give you two examples. I was based in London working for an international NGO called Panos Institute. And the mandate of Panos was information for development, based on the premise that a lot of steps are missed without key information, either for policymakers or either for donors and all of that. So ensuring that information becomes a catalytic ingredient in the development process was what Panos was all about. And so I worked in Panos and was the regional director for East and Southern Africa, working on information for development activities in countries within Eastern and Southern Africa. And when you talk about information for development, the media becomes key. And this was at the time when African media were not so free. There were countries that had not opened up their media. And therefore, a lot of what I did was to sensitize and train journalists on the importance of reporting development and on the importance of giving development information, on the importance of them understanding the whole concept of information for development. And it was a unique kind of work. And along that, I took time off to do a master's. As a result of this work, I took time off to do a master's in communication policy. And I did it over 2 years, a part-time master's program. And simply because I was interested in taking that dimension of the information for development work further. So I did a master's in communication policy at London City University. And one of the things that fascinated me about this course when I was doing it was at the cusp of a deregulation of telecoms in the industrialized world. In America, AT&T, in the UK, BT, and all of what the regulatory processes of deregulating telecoms meant. And part of the course was also looking at how deregulation of telecoms spurred the economy in different ways. And then the other aspect was the technological aspects of deregulation, and that with deregulation, much more innovation would happen as a result of that. And it did. And this was like in the mid 80s, and it did, because I saw immediately. I mean, then we started learning about voice over IP. These are very kind of ancient terminologies now, but in those days, it was coming. As a result of deregulation, there were all these technological innovations that is going to be happening, which is going to revolutionize the way information and communication is dealt with. And that for me was the grab. That for me grabbed my attention, my imagination to no end. And to the extent that my master's thesis was on deregulating telecoms in Zambia, because I had an information for development project that I was doing in Zambia, and I was visiting Zambia a lot. So I kind of said, oh, well, piggybacked on that and said, okay, whilst I'm there doing my work, I can also conduct interviews for my master, for my thesis. And that propelled me to look at what was possible, what was coming. And lo and behold, it came.
And another one of your keen areas of interest, and certainly as it relates to your work, are the SDGs. And we're into the what should be the final decade of achieving those goals by 2030, and looking at them within the context of Agenda 2063. Fairly simply, are we going to meet that deadline?
No, we're not. And COVID is one big factor.
And how far off are we? What's your biggest concern as it relates to SDGs? Which ones in particular are you most concerned about, or are they that intertwined that we really can't separate them?
Well, yeah, in some cases, they're all intertwined and we can't separate them. I think that, however, let me take one or two of the goals. I think that COVID came and exacerbated issues of hunger, which is SDG 1, exacerbated SDG 2, which is poverty. And I think health will be impacted as well. I think the whole issue of gender, women will also be impacted because women have been disproportionately affected by COVID, both in terms of their own vulnerability to COVID, as well as having to deal with households where COVID has struck. So, and I think from now on going forward, we cannot talk about achieving the SDGs without addressing what specifically is being done in a post-COVID world in each and every one of those SDGs. For instance, if you're able to address poverty, then hopefully you can put in place things that help you to address hunger. And you can also put in place things that help you to address gender equality, address health. So, you have there is that kind of interconnectedness there. And I think that COVID has thrown up the challenge to many countries as to how they're going to be able to address the SDGs, but in a different way to where they were addressing it in 2019, for instance. You cannot divorce the pandemic and the achievement of the SDGs.
And so pick up on SDG 4, looking at education and the equality and inclusive nature thereof. You had mentioned a while ago how a lot of these countries on the continent struggle to pivot because they weren't adequately set up. And you spoke of resorting to older means of television and radio. It's hard to say at this point, and I've seen quite a lot educational psychologists and other policymakers talking about the potential loss and impact of children at really acute developmental stages who would now possibly for a generation be even more lost than they would have been had COVID not come around. Is all hope lost? How do we pick that up? How do we accelerate those ICT needs and resources to make sure we don't add more numbers to more lost generations?
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that's been very clear with the pandemic is the centrality of ICTs in our everyday life now. It's not just that we're looking at education or we're looking at health. I mean, the centrality of ICTs has become quite important. Now, one of the things that I worry about is that governments rush to kind of make makeshift arrangements for the use of ICTs in education. They rushed to kind of introduce education through radio and television. But we also know and recognize that there is, for you to be able to successfully create an e-learning and online learning experience, there are several factors that you need to look into. The first is that, is your curriculum, can it be adapted to online learning? What are the certification processes to do that? Whether it's the Ministry of Education, I would have expected that if I was a head of state of an African country, and given what happened with COVID and education, I would I would ensure that there is a unit that's set up within the Ministry of Education that really is looking at the whole online learning process and how you kind of hive off face-to-face learning and you put it into a virtual learning program. That's one. The second is that we still have internet inequalities in many African countries. You have cities which have fairly decent internet, where middle income, middle class families can have access to. You move out of the city of the rich suburbs into slums. Now, I don't think that they would have access to internet. However, we in Africa have one thing that's going for us technologically, which is mobile. And so if you are a ministry and you're contemplating online learning or e-learning, then how does mobile become the tool that you use? And what does that require in terms of formatting educational materials and the delivery of education via mobile technology? So that's another set of things to think about. Are your teachers adequately trained and prepared to deliver curriculum in that mode? And again, what does it take? Because teacher training has to accommodate all these elements. And then, as I had begun with certification and all of that, how do you now, because then the whole ethos or there's a paradigm shift in how education is delivered. And what does that take and what does that mean? And I'm not sure many African countries have had the chance to look at, to examine that.
Are we teaching the right stuff? We often struggle between what is necessary for the now and lacking, going back to that vision we were talking about earlier, as far as our leaders go. Are we teaching the right stuff for the future? Are we thinking far enough ahead when we look at curricula and what goes into it?
No, we're not. We're not. Look, one of the things even before COVID that worried me was this whole advent of the fourth industrial revolution. And the fourth industrial revolution is going to change how we work and how we play and how we learn and all of that. But more than that, it was a game changer in where the evolution of the information society had reached, which is that, it's pivoting us into an era where if you don't have digital skills, you're screwed. And because, and the basis for the fourth industrial revolution was a technologically savvy and prepared workforce with technical skills, but not just technical skills, but digital skills that require problem solving, analysis within the context of a digital era, or should I say within the context of an advanced digital era. And what worried me for Africa was that nobody was really thinking about that. And as a result of that, of the fourth industrial revolution, you're going to have a situation where certain jobs won't exist any longer. And what does that mean? And if I was a policymaker in Africa, I'll be thinking about that, because now is the time. Then that gives you the basis to be looking ahead and thinking, my God, what are the skills that will prepare Africa or African countries and their populations to be prepared for this new dimension of technological advancement. And I just felt that should be the starting point, where you'll be examining curricula, because that requires that you have to overhaul your curricula and look at introducing certain courses that lays the foundation educationally for your population. And that I don't think was happening.
You spoke earlier about, at the time during your studies and during your master's research, looking at voice over IP, which was just, it was coming. It has now come. Looking ahead,
and gone.
It's come and it's gone. Looking ahead, what do you see coming?
Looking ahead, I see you sitting in your office in Cape Town and using your Apple Watch to turn on the lights in your house. That's what's coming. It's already here.
It's already here.
Mm-hmm.
We need to rely on the South African government to keep the lights on for any of that scenario to work. So. I want to talk about I think it was the second book, if the books are indeed ordered, and your work with illicit currency flows and looking at financial transactions on the continent. We've got very low penetration rates as far as that is concerned. And again, all of that linked to connectivity issues and data ties in quite nicely to the looking ahead. I was reading a piece by Michael Jordan, who I don't know if you're familiar with. He's the former CEO of First National Bank in South Africa and is now a venture capitalist. And he was writing a piece of essentially using blockchain and creating an African currency. And he had written the piece. A cryptocurrency specific, an African coin, and written the piece and said, don't laugh at me, but I think this is what may just solve our troubles in the years to come, a unified Africa with a unified currency. In excess of 40 different currencies across the continent alone. Intra-African trade being some of the lowest in the world as far as regional trading blocks and areas are concerned. Taking advantage of technology and what's available to us. Looking ahead, what should we be building towards?
Yeah, it is a very difficult subject area. And again, it is difficult because I'm putting myself 20 years back when we was introducing the whole concept of ICT for D, and you had people that could make it happen not believing in it and saying, no, we're not ready for that yet. We're at this stage, the same stage with digital currencies, where there is very little awareness, particularly in our financial and monetary institutions. They're still very much stuck in their old ways. And therefore, what is typical is that they're not looking beyond the frameworks that they operate in, which is very conservative and staid and handed over from colonial times, and they've kind of tweaked it around. Digital currency is now the new, oh, well, but we need it in Africa. And you hear that a lot, that we are not prepared enough. And I want to ask the question. I know, for instance, I have been talking to people about an African coin, the equivalent of an African Bitcoin. And I was talking to some colleagues about that. And I kid you not, the first reaction I got from that person was that, it's very destructive to the environment. It's too energy intensive. So that's one reaction. The next reaction was that, is Africa really ready for this? Will it work? So when it comes to technology and how technology can propel Africa, throughout my career, I keep getting these kinds of doubting Thomases. And it saddens me, because I would have thought that, and that was the question I was asking before I went into this, that our central banks looking into digital currency and how it can work for them and the economies that they manage? That for me is the question. And I'll tell you, no. The last time I had a meeting, I had a consortium, because I'm setting up a digital company. That's part of the thing that I'll be working on. And the person that I was talking to, I said, we need to think about a coin, an African coin. And the person said, yeah, but I don't know, because the Central Bank of Nigeria has banned cryptocurrencies. So for me, what is missing is the advocacy that is required to move governments to begin to acknowledge, not to acknowledge, but to realize that they can use these currencies to their advantage. The other thing that also I found disconcerting when I spoke to one policymaker was that, oh, well, even the United States are not very happy with crypto. The federal government might be making some, unfriendly noises, but by heck, it's made millionaires out of people. I trade in cryptocurrency, and I wake up, the first thing I do is I go and check how my coins are doing. So anyway, I think that it is something that needs to be considered. And this is my God honest opinion, that there will come a crunch, as we've come across a crunch with the pandemic, where having a digital currency is going to be critical. Is going to be critical.
Is that part of the solution to combating those illicit financial flows?
Yeah, it is. I tell you why. Because the illicit financial flows that leaves Africa is also as a result of the fact that Africa is not technologically sophisticated. And therefore, the flows that are going, for instance, someone was telling me the other day that one of the disadvantages of blockchain and crypto is that people will begin to turn the monies into cryptos, and that's how the flows will leave Africa. And that's possible. And that's possible. And if Africa says it's not ready for crypto, then it means that it's going to be robbed of its resources, even at another level. And I think that Africa should be ready for anything, and should be ready for anything that is a phenomenon that is happening. Because what happens is that it then becomes a phenomenon that is used to rip Africa of its assets. And believe you me, there have been a lot of the things that you hear about crypto in Africa. You hear of what the Russians are doing, you hear of what other, money laundering, and it's turning into crypto. So if we don't become proactive in getting a digital currency, somebody will come and create a digital currency for themselves, and then we will all be using it to better an outsider.
Who leads this? The AU?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, if the program in UNECA had been allowed to stand, perhaps it would have evolved into some of these things.
The gigantuan task of completing digital transformation on the continent. Where do we start? What path are we continuing on? How do we ensure access for all?
Well, you ensure access for all when you've put the infrastructure in place. And so if infrastructure continues to be, ICT infrastructure continues to be a problem, I know that some countries were putting in place broadband backbones, which would be the digital backbone for rollout of ICTs. I haven't been tracking how far that has gone. But you see, you cannot talk about access when you don't, you know, when you have a, you don't have the infrastructure that is out there, that is laid out. Because once you have the access, then you are able to determine the kind of costs and rates that you're going to charge, and whether cities will have to pay in rates that subsidize access for rural areas or vulnerable groups, and if they're vulnerable groups, and what does access mean for them, and all of that. I mean, right now the access to ICTs is so skewed, and quite frankly, this is what makes ICT prices in Africa quite far more costly than anywhere else in the world. And it's because you cannot start talking about ICT for all or access for all when you don't have the infrastructure to support that. So for me, that's critical.
And we do so whilst being concerned. Should we be concerned about where that funding comes from and neo-colonial tendencies?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But you see, this goes back to the point I made, that we are not blessed on this continent to have forward-looking, visionary thinking technocrats, technological technocrats who, when you compare it to maybe some countries in Asia, where for them, technology was the means to an end, and it became very central to their development paradigm. We still are not quite there with that ICT as a centerpiece of our development paradigm. And so we kind of tinker around the edges, we kind of introduce this here and there. But if you do not think ahead and say, just as you need roads, and Biden said it recently, just as you need roads, just as you need bridges, you also need broadband, right?
Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, is now
the Secretary of Transport,
Secretary of Transport, who said, on Fox News no less, had said broadband is infrastructure.
It is. It is. It is. And so if you don't think about that, and if you are having the Republicans fighting this, then think of Africa. I mean,
Yeah, what we all need is really boring, bland technocrats leading us. So I've got some very quick, whatever comes to mind, immediate answer kind of questions to wrap it out here. Do you know how many African countries have you visited? Have you kept count?
No.
I imagine dozens.
At least 40.
At least 40. It's a good number. Could you pick a favorite?
Oh wow. No, I think they all have different meanings to me.
One thing people should know about the continent.
It is diverse. It is diverse. Our customs, our culture has there are some lines running through it, from north to south, from Cape to Cairo, in terms of our customs and culture, but it is diverse. It is not a country, as some people mistakenly think.
What is Africa's best kept secret?
It's people.
What's your favorite innovation from the last 2 decades?
Well, I think the innovation for me has been the mobile revolution, which has helped us leapfrog. That's one innovation. I'm also happy to know that there are a number of innovations. Some of them like M-Pharma, which is a mobile medical tracking device. But there are a number of innovations. I co-created the Innovation Prize for Africa, and I saw the plethora of innovations that Africans were doing. And therefore, in a sense, I can't just take one out. The fact that innovation is happening in Africa at all, given the challenges, for me, is one of the biggest innovations.
What are you most optimistic about the continent?
I'm optimistic that the youth of this continent will make a difference.
So it doesn't sound like you're retiring, which is a good thing, because we cannot lose we cannot lose the brain power. You're writing the 2 books. You kind of threw away as an aside that you're starting a digital company. Are you able to share a bit more on what that is and what the plan is?
Oh, well, the digital company is going to be looking at 3 things. The first, which we started on, is looking at creating apps for, it's a kind of a luxury app for Ghana. We're starting in Ghana to support. It's actually a food delivery app, with COVID and all of that. So that's one, and several other things are in the pipeline. But I think out of that, it's the most advanced. The other is also going into 3D printing.
Do you have plans to kick your feet up, even just for 5 minutes?
I'll do that after this interview. I'll put my feet up.
Many thanks to Aida for her time, and thanks to you too for listening. If you've enjoyed our time together, please rate and subscribe to the podcast and share it widely. For more information on the courses, webinars, and virtual events that eLearning Africa has available, please visit elearning-africa.com.